Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Today we're going to do another episode of the Memory Lane series, the place where we take a look back at some interesting articles and interviews from old guitar magazines. This time we're going to look at the February 2nd, 2012 issue of Rolling Stone magazine. Here's what the cover looks like. You can see David Bowie on the cover there. That's what the article will be about, David Bowie. This article was written by Michael Gilmore. So this article will give us some information about how demons in David Bowie's personal life took a toll on his music. So let's get started. Here we go. It says, David Bowie became a star like no other. His album sold at a faster rate than that of any music artist in Britain since the Beatles, and his concerts with the Spiders from Mars became prized and legendary events. Nobody had ever looked like Bowie did. The skeletal face riven with audacious lightning bolts, penetrating eyes that didn't match in color. Nobody moved like him, with impossible grace at moments, then in jerky, bent, almost inhuman angles at others. Nobody wore the clothes he wore. Princely yet feminine robes, tight pants that presented his sex as the center of his being, as the focus of the stage. Bowie would claim that he intended Ziggy Stardust as only a theatrical creation, but I play that character right down the line. When during a June 1972 Oxford Town Hall show, Bowie sank to his knees before Mick Ronson, wrapped his hands behind the guitarist, and pulled Ronson and his guitar to his mouth in a mime of... The effect was titanic. The moment, which was a surprise to Ronson, was caught by camera and printed in the music papers. Bowie immediately worried that he had gone too far. At the same time, he extended the risk offstage. In his most famous interview in Melody Maker in 1972, he spontaneously announced, "I'm gay, and always have been, even when I was David Jones." Later he worried, had what he said destroyed his chances of being accepted in America? In truth, Bowie was bisexual, and being married with a child probably made his statement more provocative and puzzling. In 1983, he would tell Kurt Loder in Rolling Stone that saying he was bisexual was the biggest mistake I ever made. Critic John Gill thought that Bowie had used and betrayed gay culture, but also admitted that he had emboldened many people to be more open about their sexuality. Singer Tom Robinson said, "For gay musicians, Bowie was seismic with whether he disowned us later." Bowie and the Spiders from Mars bassist Trevor Bolder, drummer Woody Woodmansey, and guitarist Ronson toured incessantly for 18 months in 1972 and 1973. In Fred and Judy Vermaal's 1985 Starlust, Secret Life of Fans, a member of the audience told the authors, "A lot of men were throwing off their underwear and showing their all over the place. A lot of fluid was flying about. One girl was actually sucking someone at the same time as trying to listen to what was going on. I thought it was extraordinary because nobody had any inhibitions." Mike Garson, who later played piano with Bowie for years, told David Buckley, "I heard all those stories about what was going on in the audience, and I tend to believe them. I remember seeing crazy stuff. That night at the Hammersmith Odeon in 1973 was the last fling. I really did want it all to come to an end," Bowie wrote in Moonage Daydream. "I was now writing for a different kind of project, and exhausted and completely bored with the whole Ziggy concept. Couldn't keep my attention on the performance. I was wasted and miserable." At the concerts and before the encore performance of Rock and Roll Suicide, Bowie addressed the crowd. "Not only is this the last show of the tour," he said, "but it is the last show we'll ever do. Bye-bye, we love you." The audience was stunned. So were the Spiders from Mars. David Bowie had abandoned his alter ego and fired his band in the same moment, in public. It was an example of Bowie's fabled ability to cut off relationships, to move past them as he tried to move past himself. Angela claimed to be surprised as well. She said that after the event she was persona non grata. David never confided in her or collaborated with her in quite the same ways. I'm gonna take a drink real quick. My throat is getting dry. That's better. Okay, where were we? Ziggy Stardust bothered Bowie for a long time. It became what he thought he had to live down, or surpass. He hoped he could relinquish the character, yet hold on to the growing audience that the image had won for him. But Aladdin Sane and Diamond Dogs were essentially continuations. The music got deeper, riskier, more complicated, meaner, the viewpoint more toxic. But it was still the world and character of Ziggy Stardust. In 1974, Bowie launched an elaborate tour of North America. This time, musicians were regulated behind a screen, unseen, as Bowie commanded the stage with brilliant choreography and cumbersome props such as a cherry picker crane that malfunctioned once, leaving him suspended far above an arena floor for many minutes. His singing was, if anything, better. He had an astonishing range and control, but he grew bored with the tour midway through. He wanted to revise his sound to make it soulful and funky. He brought in guitarist Carlos Alomar, who had worked at Harlem's Apollo Theater and had played with James Brown, and he recruited Luther Vandross to arrange backing vocals. He met John Lennon, and the two wrote and recorded Fame for David Bowie's 1975 Young Americans. The song and album were Bowie's first massive hits in the U.S. Bowie also developed an obsession with cocaine during this period, and it took him into a frenzy, delusion, and terror. He lived for a time in a Manhattan townhouse, but after a tense conflict there one night with Jimmy Page, Bowie believed that the Led Zeppelin guitarist, who owned the English home of late black magic philosopher Aleister Crowley, had put his soul in peril. He moved to Los Angeles and continued to disintegrate, staying up for days without sleep, sustaining himself on a diet of milk, peppers, and cocaine. Studying occult literature and practices, he phoned Angela in London asking for her help. Witches intended for him to impregnate one during Walpurgis night. He later said Satan was living in his indoor swimming pool. David needed an exorcism. I really walked into other worlds, he later said, and Angela got him one, though it was by way of a long-distance phone call. David was never insane, Angela wrote. The really crazy stuff coincided precisely with his ingestion of enormous amounts of cocaine, alcohol, and whatever other drugs. In any event, the riot may have helped break Bowie's fear of a fiend possessing him. It was time to get out of this terrible lifestyle I'd put myself into and get healthy, he later said. It was time to pull myself together. In late 1976, following a suggestion by writer Christopher Isherwood, Bowie moved to West Berlin with his friend Iggy Pop. For a time, the retreat only relocated Bowie's troubles. He became a heavy drinker. He threw up in alleys at night. He reportedly called out to people, "Please help me." He also did worse. He became intrigued by Third Reich history and Nazi mythology. He had said years earlier in an interview, "I believe very strongly in fascism." In 1974, he told Playboy, Adolf Hitler was one of the first rock stars. Look at some of the films and see how he moved. I think he was quite as good as Jagger. In strange fascination, Buckley reports that customs officers detained Bowie at the Russian-Polish border in April 1976 and seized a collection of Nazi memorabilia. When an assistant later criticized him for his interest, Bowie grew infuriated. I changed the world, he said. Kiss my... Then broke down and cried. The worst moment came in 1976 when Bowie arrived in an open-top Mercedes-Benz convertible at London's Victoria Station and was photographed giving what some people wrongly thought was a Nazi salute. The reaction in England was furious. Bowie was sickened when he saw the photo. "I'm not a fascist," he told Melody Maker in October 1977. "That didn't happen. I just waved. On the life of my child, I waved." The longer Bowie stayed in Berlin, the more he came to understand the ruin that fascism had done to Germany and Europe. He was repelled by nationalists and racists and was horrified to see his name made into a swastika in graffiti. He later called his interest ghastly and said he had been coming out of a year of terrible duress. I was out of my mind, totally, completely crazed. Yet Bowie still made exceptional music in the post-Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars years. The title track of Station to Station from 1976 sounded like a battle for the soul between a lockdown authoritarian structure and raging anarchic guitars. With 1977's Low recorded with the input of avant-gardist and former Roxy Music keyboardist Brian Eno, Bowie devised a new language of music from fragments, accidents, and dreamed-up textures. At first, Bowie's label, RCA, did not want to release Low. However, along with Heroes from that same year, the album went on to inspire a generation or more of new artists, from Joy Division to Trent Reznor, and proved David Bowie's most sonically influential work. He still moved on. He left manager Tony DeFries in 1975, and he divorced Angela in 1977. The marriage, hold that thought, better get another drink. The marriage had begun to strain in the days after their son Duncan was born in 1971. Traumatized by the birth and making little claim to maternal instinct, Angela left on vacation to Italy a few days later with a friend. The behavior may have reminded Bowie too much of his mother, a breach of faith and abandonment of a child. In the period prior to the divorce, Angela attempted suicide more than once and tried to humiliate David in the process. I really want David to suffer, she said. She no doubt took too much credit for Bowie's fame and success, and he probably gave her too little recognition in return. David won sole custody of Duncan, who in later years rarely communicated with his mother. David, though, proved a wonderful father with time. The calling helped mend him. Bowie remarried in April 1992 to fashion model Iman. He was still subject to instances of depression, but he had also found steadiness and solace. Without Iman, he told a friend, I'd have put my head in the oven by now. Bowie and Iman have a daughter, Alexandria, born in August 2000. In 1983, after a 3-year absence from recording popular music, Bowie moved to a new label, EMI, and made the biggest album of his career, Let's Dance. He also embarked on the first of several spectacular worldwide tours. He was a global superstar now. He had remade himself. There was, at long last, no room for Ziggy Stardust on his stage. During that period, he briefly mentioned his half-brother Terry during an interview. It is my fault we grew apart, he said, and it is painful. Terry had tried to kill himself the year before by falling from a window of the facility where he was confined. According to Christopher Sanford in Bowie, Loving the Alien, Bowie saw his brother soon after, their first visit in 10 years, and brought him clothes, books, and his own music. Terry expected Bowie to return. He told his nurses that his brother would save him, but the two never saw each other again. On December 27, 1984, Terry left the Cane Hill Psychiatric Hospital, went to a nearby train station, and laid his head on the tracks. At the last moment, he pulled his head away from harm. He also tried to take an overdose of sleeping pills that day and demanded to be taken to his mother's home, where David would be waiting. The next month, on January 16th, he left Cane Hill again and went back to the train station, and once more put his head on the tracks. It was the last thing Terry Burns ever did. He was 47. Bowie did not attend his funeral, but he sent a card and roses. The card read, "You've seen more things than we can imagine, but all those moments will be lost, like tears washed away by the rain. God bless you, David." Bowie's later work never really transcended his early 1970s inventions. Pop artists don't often get an opportunity to change the world more than once, how things look and sound, and to change what's allowed, how power and authority lose some sancticity. David Bowie did that more effectively than most. Whether he ever truly resented rock and roll or not, he used it for what rock and roll does best, to give voice to those who had been without it. Most memorably, he did it for people who rock and roll hadn't altogether welcomed, people who perhaps weren't yet sure who they were or would be allowed to be. He helped them clarify themselves. He gave them permission and encouragement to figure out what their identity without shame, to exhibit pleasure in themselves and in one another. He reached out and told them, "Give me your hands because you're wonderful. Oh, give me your hands." The measure of Bowie's success isn't whether or not he could remake himself and move on. The measure is that he helped others to proclaim identities that they had once been shamed or intimidated into denying. Ziggy Stardust proved to be a deliverer, but David Bowie proved to be the man who delivered him. So that's the end of the article. Love him or hate him, David Bowie was not afraid to be who he was. Gave you an idea of how different the perception of people was back in that day. The atmosphere was a lot different. People weren't open to accepting gay people. People were afraid to admit they were gay or bisexual or whatever. And David Bowie helped change that. We still see, to a certain extent today, some criticism against the LGBTQ community. However, David Bowie helped encourage people, like the last few enlightening sections of the article said, to not be afraid to come forward and admit who they really were. He encouraged them to take pride in themselves. So without David Bowie, I doubt that we would have made as much progress when it came to gay rights as we have today. We've come a long way since David Bowie's time. I think he would be proud of the progress that we've made so far. So that does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.